The hospital changed after midnight. During the day, the corridors were loud with conversations, rolling carts, and the constant movement of families and doctors. But after midnight, everything slowed. The fluorescent lights dimmed slightly along the long corridors, and the sounds of machines became more noticeable than the voices of people. Heart monitors pulsed in steady rhythms. IV pumps clicked softly. Somewhere far down the hall, a ventilation unit hummed with mechanical patience. The night shift moved through the building like a small crew sailing a quiet ship through dark water. Fewer staff, fewer supervisors, fewer interruptions. Most people believed the night was easier. Those who worked it knew better. The night did not forgive mistakes. At the far end of the surgical ward, the night nurse worked quietly between patient rooms. Her name badge read, Elena Ward, though most of the staff simply called her the night nurse from the East Wing. She had started working these shifts only a few months earlier, and she kept mostly to herself. She spoke when needed, documented carefully, and rarely lingered at the nurse station where others gathered during slow hours. Nothing about her seemed unusual at first glance. She wore the same navy scrubs as everyone else. Her hair was tied back neatly. Her movements were calm, almost deliberate. But if someone had watched her closely for more than a few minutes, they might have noticed that she never rushed. Yet she never wasted emotion either. Every supply she used returned to exactly the same place. Every patient assessment followed the same precise order: breathing, skin color, pulse, eyes, hands. Then the monitors. It was a pattern so consistent it looked less like routine and more like training. Inside room C214, an elderly patient stirred as she entered. The man had undergone abdominal surgery earlier that day and spent most of the evening drifting between sleep and discomfort. Elena approached the bed quietly and checked the IV line before adjusting the monitor leads that had shifted during the patient's movement. "Try to breathe slowly," she said in a calm voice. The man nodded weakly. Her tone carried no urgency, but something about it made people listen. She checked his pulse without looking at the clock. After a few seconds, she released his wrist and wrote the reading into the tablet attached to the bed rail. When she finished, she paused for a moment, longer than most nurses would have. Her eyes moved once across the room, the oxygen line, the floor beneath the bed, the patient's breathing again. Then she stepped out into the hallway. The corridor was quiet. A janitor pushed a cleaning cart slowly past the far intersection, the wheels squeaking every few seconds. At the central nurse station, two younger nurses sat beside the charting computers. One of them yawned while scrolling through patient notes. "Feels like a slow night," she said. "Let's hope it stays that way," the other replied. Elena placed a sealed pack of gauze back into the supply drawer before checking the inventory list pinned beside it. Several trauma kits were missing items. She opened one, rearranged the contents, and replaced two of the dressings with fresh ones from the storage cabinet. The process took less than a minute, and when she finished, the pack looked untouched. One of the younger nurses noticed her working and leaned back in her chair. "You organize those things like someone's actually going to use them tonight." Elena closed the drawer quietly. "If someone does, they should work." The nurse shrugged and returned to her screen. Across the hall, an orderly wheeled an empty stretcher toward the elevator bay. Elena's eyes followed the stretcher for a brief second before she returned to reviewing patient charts. Her gaze moved quickly across the information on the screen: blood pressure trends, oxygen levels, post-operative notes. She memorized patterns faster than most people realized. A sudden drop in numbers hours earlier, a medication adjustment, a possible complication if the trend continued. She updated the monitoring schedule without mentioning it to anyone. Experience had taught her that early adjustments prevented loud emergencies later. 10 minutes passed quietly. The ward lights flickered once as the backup generator completed its nightly system check. Down the hallway, a patient coughed sharply, and another nurse stepped into the room to assist. Elena remained at the station, watching the corridor without appearing to watch anything at all. Hospitals had rhythms the same way cities did. Certain sounds belonged, certain sounds did not. She listened the way some people listen to distant weather. Eventually, the elevator doors opened at the far end of the hall. A paramedic stepped out carrying a clipboard. That alone was not unusual. Hospitals received transfers throughout the night. But the man's posture carried tension. His shoulders were tight, and he moved quickly toward the reception desk instead of walking calmly through the ward. The receptionist spoke with him briefly before picking up the phone. Elena did not move from her chair, but her attention shifted slightly toward the conversation. The paramedic spoke in short sentences, pointing back toward the elevator. The receptionist nodded and began dialing another department. At the nurse station, one of the younger nurses leaned forward. "Probably another overnight transfer," she muttered. Elena said nothing. She simply watched the paramedic for a few seconds longer before returning her gaze to the screen. But her hand had already moved to the supply list again. She stood and walked to the storage cabinet without explanation. Inside the cabinet, rows of medical kits hung in careful order. She checked 3 of them quickly. Gauze, tourniquet, pressure bandage, saline, everything placed where it should be. When she finished, she closed the door gently. Behind her, the receptionist's voice carried across the quiet ward. "Highway accident," she said into the phone. "Multiple vehicles." The words did not cause panic at the station. Highway accidents happened often enough that hospitals had protocols ready. Most of the serious cases went directly to the emergency department across the building. The surgical ward rarely saw the first wave. One of the nurses sighed. "ER is going to have a long night." Elena returned to her chair slowly. For a moment, she sat completely still, listening to the distant mechanical hum of the building. Then she reached forward and adjusted the schedule board mounted beside the computer. She moved 2 patient checks earlier in the rotation and placed a trauma kit on the corner of the desk. The nurse beside her noticed the movement. "Expecting something?" Elena's voice remained calm. "Just being ready." The younger nurse shrugged again and looked back at her charting screen. The hospital returned to its quiet rhythm for another minute. Then, far outside the building, faint but unmistakable, a siren began to rise through the night air. 1 became 2, then 3. The sound carried through the glass entrance doors and echoed faintly along the corridor walls. Several staff members looked up from their stations. Ambulances rarely arrived together unless something serious had happened. Elena did not look toward the windows. Instead, she opened the trauma kit beside her and checked the contents once more. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, tightening a strap on the tourniquet before resealing the pack. When she finished, she rested her palm lightly on the closed kit. The sirens outside grew louder. Around her, the staff continued working, unaware that the quiet rhythm of the night was already beginning to break. And somewhere beyond the hospital doors, the first ambulance was already turning into the emergency entrance. At the nurse station, Elena Ward finally stood. Her posture was calm, her expression unchanged, but deep beneath the quiet routine of the ward, something older than hospital training had already begun to wake, a kind of preparation that did not belong to ordinary night shifts. Because long before this hospital had gone silent under fluorescent lights, she had learned what it meant when too many sirens arrived at once, and she knew the next hour would decide who survived the night. The first ambulance reached the hospital entrance at 1:17 a.m. The siren cut off abruptly as the vehicle stopped beneath the emergency canopy, leaving behind a sudden silence that lasted only a second before the rear doors swung open. 2 paramedics jumped out, pulling a stretcher from the back with urgent efficiency. The patient on it was barely visible beneath blood-soaked blankets. One of the paramedics shouted instructions as they rushed through the sliding doors toward the emergency department. Inside the surgical ward, the sound of rolling wheels echoed faintly through the corridors. Most nights, patients arrived one at a time. Quiet transfers, routine complications. This was different. Another ambulance followed less than 30 seconds later. Then another. At the nurse station, several staff members looked up as the distant noise of activity began to grow. Phones rang in short bursts. Someone down the hall opened a supply cabinet too quickly, and the metal door slammed against the frame. "What happened?" one of the nurses asked. The receptionist answered without looking away from the phone pressed to her ear. "Highway collision. Multiple vehicles. Police say more units are on the way." The words carried across the quiet ward like a ripple spreading through water. Elena stood beside the supply cabinet where she had been restocking trauma kits only minutes earlier. She listened to the exchange without speaking. The tone in the receptionist's voice told her more than the words themselves. This was not a simple accident. Something had gone very wrong on that highway. Within minutes, the emergency department began sending updates through the hospital network. Too many patients were arriving at once. The trauma bays were filling faster than doctors could process them. Non-critical patients were being moved out of the emergency wing to make space for incoming casualties. That was when the first stretcher appeared at the entrance to the surgical ward. Two paramedics pushed it quickly down the corridor, while a young intern walked beside them, reading from a clipboard. The patient was a middle-aged man, whose breathing came in shallow bursts. Blood covered the lower half of his shirt, where a deep laceration ran along his ribs. "Temporary placement," the intern said quickly to the nurse station. "ER needs space. Trauma surgeons are still 20 minutes out." The paramedics rolled the stretcher into the nearest empty room. Elena followed them inside without being asked. The intern began speaking again, explaining the limited information they had gathered during transport. Vehicle rollover, possibly 2 impacts, blood pressure unstable. The intern's voice carried the nervous tension of someone facing a situation they had never fully trained for. Elena listened quietly while pulling on a pair of gloves. The patient groaned as the stretcher locked into place beside the bed. Elena lifted the blanket carefully and examined the wound. The cut along the ribcage was deep but clean, not the worst injury she had seen. But the bleeding was steady and the patient's skin had already begun losing color. "Pressure dressing," she said calmly. The intern hesitated for half a second before handing her the gauze. Elena worked quickly but without visible urgency. She pressed the dressing firmly into the wound while checking the patient's pulse with her other hand. Weak, fast. She secured the bandage tightly before glancing at the monitor. The oxygen reading was dropping slowly. "Increase oxygen flow," she said. The intern adjusted the valve immediately. The paramedics exchanged a brief glance. Something about the way the quiet nurse had taken control of the room felt unusual, but neither of them questioned it. Within 2 minutes, the bleeding slowed, and the patient's breathing stabilized slightly. Elena stepped back and removed her gloves. "He will hold for now," she said. The intern nodded, visibly relieved. Outside the room, the corridor had begun to fill with movement. Another stretcher arrived only minutes later, then another. Soon the surgical ward, normally reserved for recovering patients, started receiving casualties from the emergency department faster than staff could process them. Some patients had broken limbs, others suffered head injuries. One young man arrived unconscious with severe chest trauma from the steering wheel impact. Nurses moved between rooms carrying equipment and medication trays. Voices grew louder, instructions overlapped. A sense of pressure began building through the ward, like rising water. Elena moved steadily from room to room, assisting wherever the situation seemed most unstable. She did not raise her voice. She did not run. Yet she always seemed to arrive exactly where she was needed before anyone called for help. In room 218, a patient began struggling to breathe. Elena stepped forward and adjusted the airway position before the attending nurse even reached the bedside. In room 220, she noticed a slow bleed beneath a patient's shoulder that others had overlooked. A compression bandage stopped it within seconds. Her actions were small, efficient corrections rather than dramatic interventions, but together they prevented several situations from turning critical. At the nurse station, one of the younger nurses watched Elena return from another patient room with quiet focus. "How does she keep spotting things before the monitors even alarm?" the nurse whispered. No one answered. The ward doors opened again as 2 paramedics pushed another stretcher inside. This patient was worse. The man's clothing was torn and dark with blood. Shards of glass were embedded across his arms and neck. One paramedic spoke quickly while they moved. "Multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding. ER ran out of trauma space." Elena stepped forward immediately. Her eyes moved across the injuries in a quick, controlled sweep. For a moment, her expression changed slightly. Not shock, recognition. She had seen wounds like these before. The paramedic continued speaking, unaware of the silent assessment taking place. "We stabilized what we could on the road." Elena nodded once. "Bring him here." They pushed the stretcher into the largest room on the ward. Several nurses gathered nearby, unsure how to begin treating injuries of this scale outside the emergency department. Elena opened a fresh trauma kit from the supply cabinet. Her hands moved automatically through the contents. Gauze, saline, tourniquet, pressure bandage. The rhythm of preparation felt older than the hospital itself. One of the nurses noticed the way she handled the equipment. "Where did you learn to work that fast?" Elena did not answer the question. Instead, she stepped beside the stretcher and began cleaning blood away from one of the deeper wounds along the patient's shoulder. The injury was narrow but deep, likely caused by metal fragments during the crash. She pressed gauze against it while examining the bleeding pattern. "This one first," she said quietly. The nurses followed her instructions without realizing they were doing so. Outside the room, more sirens approached the hospital. The emergency department radio crackled through the overhead system as staff reported incoming casualties. What had begun as a single highway accident was turning into something larger. Multiple vehicles had collided during the night rain. Some drivers had been trapped inside their cars for nearly an hour before rescue teams reached them. Now the injured were arriving all at once. In the surgical ward, the pace continued rising. Elena worked beside the stretcher without pause, stabilizing wounds one after another. She noticed details others overlooked: the angle of broken glass in the skin, the color shift in a patient's lips, the way breathing changed when pain spread deeper into the chest. Each small observation guided her next decision. A young doctor stepped into the room after finishing a call with the emergency department. He watched Elena secure another compression bandage with surprising efficiency. "You've handled trauma cases before?" he asked. Elena tightened the final strap before answering. "A few." The doctor nodded, though he sensed the answer was incomplete. Across the ward, alarms from another room began sounding rapidly. Someone shouted for assistance. Elena turned her head toward the noise immediately. Her eyes sharpened with the quiet focus of someone listening to a familiar battlefield signal. She placed the last piece of gauze onto the tray beside the bed and removed her gloves slowly. Around her, the ward was no longer calm. Patients filled nearly every room. Nurses moved between beds with increasing urgency. The first wave of casualties had arrived, but Elena knew something the others did not yet realize. This was only the beginning. Because accidents like the one described over the emergency radio rarely produced just a handful of patients. They produced waves, and somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the next wave was already on its way. Elena stepped into the hallway again, scanning the ward with quiet attention. The staff were doing their best, but the pressure was beginning to show. If the next arrivals were worse, the system would begin to break. She looked once toward the supply cabinet where the remaining trauma kits were stored. Then she turned toward the nurse station and began moving the equipment closer to the patient rooms. No announcements, no explanation, just preparation. Because she had already learned something the others were only beginning to understand. Nights like this did not stabilize on their own. They escalated, and if the hospital was about to be flooded with casualties, someone would need to bring order before the ward collapsed under the weight of its own chaos. By 1:46 a.m., the surgical ward was no longer functioning the way it normally did. The corridor outside the nurse station was crowded with equipment carts, portable monitors, and empty stretchers waiting to be cleaned and reused. The calm rhythm of the night shift had been replaced by overlapping voices and the sharp sounds of alarms. Patients filled nearly every room. Some were conscious and frightened. Others lay motionless beneath oxygen masks, while nurses moved quickly around them. The emergency department radio continued reporting incoming casualties. The trauma surgeons had been delayed by road closures near the accident site. For the moment, the hospital was handling the crisis with the staff already inside the building. Elena stood near the center of the ward, watching the movement around her. She had seen situations like this before, though never in a hospital corridor. In her experience, the moment when systems began to fail was always the same. It did not begin with panic. It began with confusion, too many patients, too many voices, no clear order of priority. She stepped toward the nurse station and looked across the patient board mounted on the wall. Rooms 214 through 221 were now filled with trauma cases transferred from the emergency department. 2 additional patients were waiting in the hallway until beds could be cleared. A young nurse hurried past carrying blood pressure equipment that should have already been assigned to another room. Another nurse was searching through a supply drawer that had already been emptied. Elena understood the problem immediately. The ward still believed it was operating like a recovery unit. but the injuries arriving tonight belonged to a trauma zone. She reached for a marker attached to the patient board and quietly drew 3 small symbols beside several room numbers. One nurse noticed the change. "What are those?" Elena answered calmly. "Priority." She did not explain further. Instead, she moved down the corridor toward room 218, where the unconscious patient with chest trauma had begun to deteriorate. The monitor beside his bed showed oxygen levels dropping steadily. A young intern stood nearby, adjusting equipment with nervous hands. Elena approached the bed and placed 2 fingers against the patient's neck. The pulse was irregular. She glanced once at the breathing pattern before adjusting the patient's shoulder position slightly. The change allowed the lungs to expand more evenly. Within seconds, the oxygen numbers began rising again. The intern looked surprised. "How did you—" Elena did not answer. She was already scanning the room. The patient's injuries suggested blunt force impact, possibly from the steering wheel during the crash. The bruising across the ribs confirmed it. If internal bleeding had started, the situation could worsen quickly. She turned to the intern. "Monitor breathing every 3 minutes." The intern nodded without hesitation. Elena stepped back into the hallway where the tension had grown thicker. Another stretcher arrived from the emergency department. This patient was younger, barely in his 20s, with a deep wound along his thigh that continued bleeding despite the bandage paramedics had applied during transport. A nurse reached for additional gauze while trying to keep pressure on the wound. Elena moved beside her. "Higher," she said quietly. The nurse adjusted her grip. Elena took the tourniquet from the trauma kit and secured it above the injury with controlled pressure. The bleeding slowed almost immediately. The nurse looked at her with a mixture of relief and confusion. "I didn't realize we had to—" Elena finished tightening the strap. "Sometimes you do." Around them, the ward continued filling with new problems. A patient in room 215 began shouting in pain. Another monitor alarm sounded down the hall. The young doctor who had been coordinating the incoming transfers stepped toward the nurse station while scanning the patient board with growing concern. "We are losing track of who needs surgery first," he said. "ER is still sending patients." Elena studied the board again. The 3 symbols she had drawn now marked the most critical injuries in the ward. She picked up the marker again and circled 2 additional rooms. The doctor noticed. "What are you doing?" "Sorting," she said. The word was simple, but the tone behind it carried quiet certainty. She walked to the center of the corridor, where several nurses had gathered uncertainly. "Room 2, 21, and 219 first," she said. "Heavy bleeding." Her voice was calm, but direct, not loud, not commanding. Yet the clarity in it cut through the noise around them. 2 nurses moved immediately toward the indicated rooms without asking questions. The doctor watched the movement with surprise. "You're triaging?" Elena looked at him briefly. "They will not wait for surgeons." The doctor hesitated only a moment before nodding slowly. He had spent years studying trauma response, but in the chaos of the last 30 minutes, the system had begun slipping beyond control. Somehow, the quiet night nurse had restored a sense of order with only a few quiet decisions. In room 219, a patient's shoulder wound began bleeding again as the compression bandage loosened. Elena entered just as the nurse struggled to hold the gauze in place. Elena stepped forward and reinforced the pressure point with steady hands. She examined the wound carefully. The pattern of damage reminded her of injuries caused by sharp metal fragments. She had treated similar wounds long before entering this hospital, in places where the nearest operating room had been hundreds of miles away. The nurse beside her spoke nervously. "Do you think the artery—" "No," Elena said calmly. "Not yet." She adjusted the dressing until the bleeding slowed again. Outside the room, another nurse rushed past carrying oxygen tanks. The ward had begun moving with a strange rhythm now. Staff followed Elena's quiet directions without formally acknowledging them. The doctor noticed the shift as well. He approached her near the hallway intersection. "You've handled disaster triage before." Elena wiped her hands clean with a sterile cloth before answering. "Situations like this." The doctor studied her expression carefully. There was no panic in her face, no hesitation, only focus, as if she had stepped into an environment she understood better than the hospital itself. "Where?" he asked. Elena glanced down the corridor where another patient had begun coughing violently. She moved toward the room before responding. Different place. Inside, room 215, she adjusted the patient's airway position again while monitoring his breathing. The cough subsided slowly. When she stepped back into the hallway, the doctor was still watching her. "You recognize injuries faster than the trauma charts," he said quietly. Elena did not respond. Instead, she walked toward the supply cabinet and removed 2 more trauma kits, placing them on a rolling cart in the center of the corridor where nurses could reach them quickly. The action looked small, almost routine, but it changed the pace of treatment immediately. Staff no longer needed to search for supplies. Everything they needed was already within reach. The doctor leaned closer to another nurse. "Has she worked trauma before?" The nurse shook her head slowly. "She started here a few months ago." Elena returned to the nurse station, where the patient board now displayed a clearer pattern of priorities. The critical cases were marked, less severe injuries were stabilized. The chaos had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped into something manageable. For the moment, the ward was holding. Elena stood quietly beside the board, listening to the sounds around her. Monitors pulsed steadily again. Voices were calmer. Nurses moved with direction instead of confusion. But beyond the hospital walls, the sirens had not stopped. Another ambulance arrived at the emergency entrance, its lights reflecting faintly through the glass doors at the end of the corridor. Elena watched the glow for a moment before turning back toward the ward. She understood the pattern too well to feel relief yet, because the first wave of casualties was only the beginning. In disasters like the one unfolding tonight, the most difficult decisions always came later, when resources ran thin, when every patient could not be saved, and when someone had to decide who received help first. Elena rested her hand briefly against the edge of the patient board before stepping away again. The ward staff still believed they were managing a difficult night shift, but Elena recognized something deeper forming beneath the surface. The quiet hospital had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer a recovery ward struggling with overflow. It had become a field of triage, and the next hour would force choices no one in the building was ready to make. By 2:28 a.m., the surgical ward had reached a fragile balance. Patients filled every available bed, and 2 additional stretchers had been placed along the corridor wall beneath portable monitors. The initial chaos had settled into something quieter, but the tension in the air had not disappeared. It hung over the ward like a weight that no one wanted to acknowledge. Nurses moved from room to room with steady concentration. Equipment carts rolled slowly across the tile floors. The alarms that had once sounded constantly now appeared only in short bursts before being silenced by quick hands. Elena stood near the nurse station, reviewing the patient board again. The symbols she had drawn earlier remained beside the most critical rooms. Most of those patients had stabilized for the moment. The bleeding had been controlled, airway positions corrected, pain medication administered where possible. But stabilization was not the same as survival. Many of them would still need surgery when the trauma team arrived. The ward had simply bought them time. A nurse approached the station with a worried expression. "Another transfer coming up from ER," she said quietly. "They say this one is critical." Elena looked down the corridor toward the elevator bay. The faint sound of wheels against metal echoed as the elevator doors opened. 2 paramedics stepped out with a stretcher between them, moving faster than the others who had arrived earlier that night. The patient was young, perhaps in his early 30s. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven movements. Dark blood stained the sheets around his abdomen. One paramedic spoke quickly as they pushed the stretcher toward the nearest open space in the hallway. "Internal injuries suspected. We lost blood pressure twice during transport." Elena stepped forward immediately. The doctor from earlier followed close behind her. Together they moved the patient onto the stretcher bed beside the wall. Elena pulled back the blanket just enough to see the wound. The injury was severe. A jagged piece of metal from the vehicle had punctured the lower abdomen during the collision. The paramedics had already done what they could during transport, but the bleeding had started again. The doctor looked at the monitor readings and shook his head slowly. "He needs surgery immediately." Elena knew that already, but the trauma surgeons had not arrived yet. Roadblocks near the accident site had delayed them further. The operating rooms were still being prepared. That meant the patient would have to survive long enough for surgical intervention to begin. Elena pressed gauze firmly against the wound to slow the bleeding. The patient groaned faintly, barely conscious. The doctor glanced toward the patient board again. How many others are waiting for surgery? Elena followed his gaze. 3. One with chest trauma, one with internal bleeding from a broken pelvis, and another whose head injury had worsened during the last hour. Resources were already thin. The surgical team would have to choose carefully when they arrived, but this patient might not survive long enough to reach that point. The doctor lowered his voice. We may have to attempt emergency intervention here. The words carried heavy uncertainty. This ward was not equipped for complex trauma surgery. Attempting such a procedure without proper equipment could risk killing the patient outright. Elena remained silent while applying pressure to the wound. Her eyes studied the bleeding pattern carefully. The injury was deep but narrow, not catastrophic yet, but it would become fatal if the bleeding continued. Around them, the ward continued moving quietly. Nurses passed by carrying medication trays. Another patient coughed in a nearby room. No one else realized the decision now forming in the hallway. The doctor spoke again. If we try to operate here, we risk losing him. Elena looked down at the patient's face, pale, breathing shallowly, barely conscious. The same expression she had seen on injured soldiers years earlier in places far from hospitals. She remembered nights when evacuation helicopters had been delayed by weather, nights when medical supplies ran low, nights when every decision carried a cost that stayed with you long after the moment passed. The doctor continued. But if we wait for surgery, he might not last. Elena said nothing for several seconds. Her hands remained steady against the wound. Then she slowly lifted her gaze toward the patient board again. 3 other critical patients waited there, all of them stable for the moment because bleeding had been controlled earlier. But if the limited staff and equipment were diverted to this one case, the balance of the ward could collapse again. A nurse approached quietly. Room 221 just dropped blood pressure again. Elena closed her eyes briefly, not out of hesitation, but calculation. The kind of quiet assessment she had once performed under far worse conditions. The doctor watched her carefully. What do you think? Elena opened her eyes again and looked down at the patient. Stabilize, she said calmly. Not surgery. The doctor frowned slightly. He might not survive the weight. Elena tightened the compression dressing carefully. If we attempt surgery here, others will lose care. The doctor followed her gaze to the patient board again. He understood the implication immediately. The ward had limited staff, limited equipment. Attempting a risky intervention on one patient could cost several others their chance of survival. It was the same brutal calculation used in battlefield medicine. Elena secured the pressure bandage more firmly before adjusting the patient's oxygen mask. We keep him alive, she said quietly, until surgeons arrive. The doctor hesitated, then nodded slowly. He understood the decision even if he wished another option existed. Elena turned to the nearby nurses. Fluids! Monitor every minute. They moved quickly to follow her instructions. Within minutes, the patient's bleeding slowed slightly under the reinforced compression. It was not a solution, only time. Elena stepped back from the stretcher and removed her gloves slowly. The doctor studied her again. You've made that decision before. Elena did not answer directly. She simply looked down the corridor where the rest of the ward continued functioning under the fragile order she had built. Sometimes saving one person means losing 3, she said quietly. The doctor did not ask where she had learned that lesson. He already suspected the answer. Across the ward, a nurse approached with a small piece of paper in her hand. Emergency department update, she said. Trauma surgeons arriving in 10 minutes. Elena nodded once. The ward had survived the worst of the pressure, for now. She returned to the nurse station and checked the patient board again, ensuring each critical case remained monitored. Her decision still weighed heavily in the hallway behind her. The young man with the abdominal wound remained alive, but barely. If the surgeons arrived in time, he might survive. If not, the choice she had made would stay with her long after the night ended. But Elena had learned long ago that medicine in crisis was not about perfect outcomes. It was about choosing the path that saved the most lives, even when the cost of that choice never fully disappeared. Outside the hospital, the sirens had finally begun to fade as emergency crews cleared the accident site. Inside the surgical ward, the quiet struggle to hold life together continued under the steady glow of fluorescent lights. And somewhere in the building's lower level, the trauma team had just stepped through the hospital doors. The night was not over yet, but the moment of decision had passed, and the ward had survived it. At 2:41 a.m., the trauma surgeons finally arrived. Their footsteps echoed quickly through the corridor as they moved from the emergency department toward the surgical ward. The doors swung open and the first surgeon stepped inside, scanning the hallway with immediate focus. He had expected chaos. That was usually what awaited when a hospital ward received trauma overflow without proper preparation. But what he saw instead slowed him for a moment. The corridor was crowded, but organized. Patients lined the rooms and stretchers, yet each one had monitors attached and dressings secured. Nurses moved with direction rather than confusion. Equipment carts stood in reachable positions instead of scattered across the floor. It looked less like a ward overwhelmed by disaster and more like a controlled triage unit. The lead surgeon approached the nurse station where the patient board displayed the hand-drawn priority markings. "Who organized this?" he asked. The young doctor from earlier pointed quietly toward the far end of the hallway. Elena stood beside a patient bed, adjusting an oxygen line. She worked with the same calm movements she had used all night. No urgency, no need for recognition, just quiet efficiency. The surgeon studied the board again before turning back to the doctor. "You marked surgical priorities already." The doctor nodded slowly. "Not me." The surgeon followed his gaze. Elena finished adjusting the oxygen valve and stepped away from the patient just as another nurse approached with updated readings. "Room 219 stable," the nurse said. "Bleeding controlled." Elena nodded once. The surgeon walked toward her with several members of the trauma team behind him. He glanced briefly at the patient she had been treating before speaking. "You're the one who set this up?" Elena removed her gloves and placed them in the disposal bin. "We stabilized who we could." The surgeon's eyes moved around the ward again, studying the placements of equipment and the order in which patients had been positioned. "You triaged this entire wing." Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she pointed quietly toward the hallway stretcher where the young man with the abdominal wound still lay under close monitoring. "He needs surgery first." The surgeon stepped beside the stretcher and examined the compression bandage. The bleeding had slowed enough to keep the patient alive, though barely. "Who held this together?" he asked again. The doctor answered before Elena could respond. "She did." The surgeon looked back toward Elena with a different expression now. Not curiosity, respect. "You bought them time," he said. Elena simply nodded. The trauma team moved into action immediately. The most critical patient was transferred toward the operating room, while others were reassessed for surgical priority. Nurses assisted as equipment was repositioned, and transport teams prepared stretchers for movement downstairs. Within minutes, the ward began shifting again, this time toward resolution instead of crisis. Elena stepped back from the activity, allowing the surgeons and trauma staff to take control. Her role had never been to command the room once the specialists arrived. It had only been to hold the line until they did. The young doctor approached her again as the surgical team wheeled the abdominal injury patient toward the elevator. "He's alive because of your call," he said quietly. Elena watched the stretcher disappear through the elevator doors before responding. "We will see." The doctor hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had lingered all night. "Where did you learn to triage like that?" Elena leaned against the nurse station briefly, while the ward slowly emptied of its most critical cases. For a moment, the fluorescent lights reflected softly across the polished floor again, the same way they had earlier in the night before the sirens began. "Combat zones," she said finally. The doctor's expression shifted with understanding. "You were a combat medic." Elena gave a small nod. The doctor looked back across the ward, where patients who had once been minutes from death now rested under stable monitors. "You never mentioned it." Elena adjusted the chart tablet beside the nurse station. "It was not necessary." Across the corridor, one of the trauma surgeons returned briefly after sending the first group of patients to surgery. He walked toward Elena and studied the patient board again. Your triage decisions were correct, he said. All of them. Elena accepted the statement without reaction. The surgeon folded his arms slightly. You should be working trauma. Elena looked toward the hallway where the last stretcher was being moved toward the elevator. Tonight I was. The surgeon smiled faintly before turning back toward the operating wing. By 3:30 a.m., the ward had grown quiet again. The stretchers that once filled the hallway had disappeared. Only a few stabilized patients remained under observation while surgeons operated downstairs. The tension that had filled the building earlier now faded slowly into exhaustion. Nurses returned equipment to cabinets. The janitor pushed his cleaning cart quietly across the floor again, wiping away faint traces of blood that had dried near the hallway walls. Elena stood beside the supply cabinet and began restocking the trauma kits she had opened earlier. Gauze replaced, tourniquets folded, dressings sealed neatly back into their packs, the same careful routine she had followed at the beginning of the shift. One of the younger nurses approached her with a tired smile. I had no idea you could handle something like that. Elena closed the cabinet door gently. Most nights we do not need to. The nurse studied her for a moment. You saved a lot of people tonight. Elena shook her head slightly. We stabilized them. The nurse wanted to say more, but the quiet tone in Elena's voice made it clear that the conversation was already finished. A few minutes later, the doctor returned once more from the operating wing. They got the abdominal case into surgery, he said. Elena nodded without looking up from the chart she was updating. Good. The doctor hesitated before speaking again. Administration will want to know what happened tonight. Elena finished the last line of documentation and closed the tablet screen. They will read the reports. The doctor understood what she meant. She had no interest in recognition, no desire to stand in front of administrators explaining how the ward had been reorganized under pressure. Her work had been done the moment the surgeons arrived. The rest belonged to the hospital system. By 4:10 a.m., the night had returned almost completely to its original quiet state. The emergency radios were silent. The hallway lights reflected softly across empty floors. Monitors pulsed slowly beside resting patients. Elena walked once more down the corridor, checking each room the same way she had earlier that night. Breathing, pulse, oxygen, small details that kept people alive long after dramatic moments passed. When she reached the end of the hallway, she paused briefly beside the window overlooking the ambulance entrance. The parking area outside was calm now. Only a single vehicle remained parked beneath the canopy. The storm of sirens had passed. Behind her, the ward continued functioning under its normal rhythm again. Elena removed her name badge briefly and wiped a small mark of dried blood from its edge before clipping it back into place. By the time the day shift arrived later that morning, most of the story would already be finished. The surgical reports would explain the injuries. The hospital logs would describe the influx of patients from the highway disaster. Staff would talk quietly about how the ward had somehow stayed functional when it should have collapsed. Some would remember the quiet night nurse who seemed to know exactly what to do before anyone else did. But Elena would not be there when those conversations happened. She finished the last supply check and walked slowly toward the staff exit at the far end of the building. The hallway lights dimmed slightly as the hospital's early morning cycle began. Behind her, patients who had arrived bleeding and broken were now sleeping under steady monitors. The ward had survived the night. Elena pushed open the staff door and stepped into the cool air outside the hospital. The sky above the city was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. She paused for a moment, listening to the quiet streets. No sirens, no chaos. Just the calm that followed a long night of holding life together, one decision at a time. Then she turned and walked away from the hospital entrance, leaving the building exactly the way she had found it, quiet, stable, and unaware that, for a few hours in the middle of the night, a former combat medic had quietly fought another kind of battlefield inside its walls.